Henry Caldwell's life had followed a predictable pattern for many years. From the outside, he seemed to have everything one could ever want: a grand mansion perched on a hill, an expansive garden with flowers blooming in every season, and a fortune so vast he could never spend it all. Yet, despite the wealth and comfort surrounding him, Henry felt an emptiness that gnawed at him in the quiet moments. The quiet moments, of course, had become nearly constant since his beloved wife Margaret passed away. Without her warmth and laughter, the house seemed more like an echoing shell than a home. He often thought about their life together, the dreams they once had, the children they never had. It wasn't for lack of trying. Fate had just not been kind in that regard. Over time, Henry had come to terms with the absence of children, and Margaret had been his world. But now, with her gone, Henry's existence felt like it had lost its purpose. He woke up each morning, shuffled through the grand halls of his house, took tea in the garden alone, and read from his vast library of books, but nothing filled the void. On the particular evening when everything changed, Henry had been out for one of his aimless drives through the city. He didn't have a destination in mind. He never did. Driving had become a way to escape the suffocating quiet of the mansion, to watch the world go by from the comfort of his car. The streets were filled with people, young couples holding hands, children running with boundless energy, and groups of friends laughing together. Henry observed them with a mix of curiosity and melancholy, knowing he would return to his empty home at the end of the drive. As he neared the poorer side of town, where old apartment buildings lined the streets and the city's neglected edges became more visible, Henry's eyes were drawn to a bus stop. There, on the worn wooden bench, sat a woman and a small child. They huddled together, the woman wrapping her arm tightly around the little girl, as if to shield her from the cold wind that blew through the street. The sight caught Henry's attention, and for reasons he couldn't quite explain, he slowed down his car. He noticed the woman glancing nervously around her, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and exhaustion. The child, a girl no older than 6 or 7, had her head resting on the woman's lap, her small body wrapped in a threadbare coat that seemed far too light for the brisk autumn evening. Something stirred in Henry's chest, a tug of compassion he hadn't felt in years. He pulled over to the side of the road and sat for a moment, debating with himself. He was not a man prone to impulsive decisions, but something about the way the woman cradled her daughter, the protectiveness in her eyes, reminded him of Margaret. His wife had always been the one to insist on helping those less fortunate. Margaret would never have driven past without stopping. With a sigh, Henry stepped out of the car, unsure of what he was about to do or say. The woman noticed him approaching and straightened, pulling her daughter closer as if expecting the worst. Henry raised his hand slightly, a gesture meant to show he wasn't a threat. "Excuse me," he said, his voice soft but clear. "Do you need any help?" The woman looked at him warily, her eyes scanning his appearance. Henry, with his neatly pressed suit and polished shoes, didn't exactly blend into the surroundings. She hesitated, clearly unsure of whether she could trust this stranger. "We're fine," she replied quietly, her voice shaky but polite. "We're just waiting for the bus." Henry glanced at the bus stop sign. The schedule taped to the post was for a route that had been discontinued months ago, a victim of city budget cuts. There would be no bus coming for them tonight. He sighed again, feeling the weight of what he was about to offer. "There won't be any buses tonight," he said, his tone gentle. "That route doesn't run anymore. Where are you headed?" The woman looked down at her daughter, who had fallen asleep despite the cold. She didn't answer for a long moment, and Henry sensed her internal struggle. Finally, she looked up, her expression one of quiet desperation. "I don't know," she admitted softly. "We don't really have anywhere to go right now." The words hit Henry like a punch to the gut. He had known poverty existed. He had seen it from the safety of his car, on the news, in passing conversations. But to hear it spoken so plainly, by a mother trying to protect her child, made it feel real in a way it never had before. Without thinking, Henry made a decision. "I have a garage," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "It's not much, but it's warm. You and your daughter are welcome to stay there, at least for tonight." The woman's eyes widened in surprise, and she looked at him as though trying to decide if he was serious or if this was some cruel joke. Henry waited patiently, giving her time to process his offer. After a long silence, she nodded slowly, tears welling in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you so much." Henry felt a strange sense of relief. He didn't know why he had done it, but it felt right. He led the woman and her daughter to his car, helping the little girl, still half asleep, into the back seat. As they drove in silence toward his mansion, Henry glanced in the rearview mirror, watching as the woman gently stroked her daughter's hair. He still didn't know her name, but he felt that in offering this small act of kindness, something in his life had shifted. When they arrived at the mansion, the woman's eyes widened in disbelief. Henry could see the awe and apprehension on her face as they pulled up to the large iron gates that led to his estate. The mansion stood tall against the backdrop of the night sky, its many windows reflecting the dim light of the moon. "I'm sorry it's not more," Henry said awkwardly as he led them to the garage. It was large and clean, though sparse. He hadn't used it in years, and it had mostly been forgotten. He motioned to the cot his housekeeper had set up earlier for gardening supplies, which now held blankets and pillows. "It's not much, but it's warm, and you'll be safe here." The woman stood there for a moment, her arms still wrapped around her daughter, as if struggling to comprehend the generosity being shown to her. She finally turned to Henry, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't even know how to thank you," she said softly. "We've been through so much." Henry waved her gratitude away. "No thanks necessary," he said gruffly. "Just get some rest." With that, he left them to settle in, but as he walked back into the empty mansion, he couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had just begun. For the first time in years, he felt like he had a purpose again, a reason to wake up the next morning. As the days passed, Emily, the woman Henry had taken in, began to integrate herself into the quiet routines of the Caldwell household. She had been hesitant at first, unsure of what was expected of her. Henry had told her that she didn't need to do anything in return for his help, but Emily was not the type to sit idle. She began offering small gestures of thanks, preparing meals, tidying up, and assisting Mrs. Jenkins with tasks around the house. Sophie, her daughter, was shy at first, but her natural curiosity soon got the better of her. She would wander the garden, her small hands trailing over the flowers, or sit quietly with a book from Henry's library. The little girl had a quiet, thoughtful nature, but every once in a while she would burst into giggles as she played in the sunshine, and Henry found himself smiling at the sound. In many ways, it was Sophie who brought life back into the mansion. Henry would watch her from the windows as she explored the grounds, and sometimes, without really knowing why, he would find himself joining her in the garden, showing her the flowers that Margaret had once loved so much. Sophie's eyes would light up as he explained the different species, and soon she began to ask him questions about the flowers, the trees, and eventually about him. Henry wasn't used to answering questions about himself. He had spent so long keeping to himself that he had almost forgotten how to engage in conversation, especially with a child. But Sophie's questions were innocent, filled with the kind of curiosity that only children possess, and slowly Henry found himself opening up to her. "Did you plant all these flowers?" Sophie asked one afternoon as they stood near the rose bushes. Henry nodded. "I did. Well, my wife and I did. She loved roses." Sophie's eyes widened. "Where is she now?" Henry paused, the familiar ache of loss settling in his chest. "She's gone now," he said quietly. Sophie seemed to sense his sadness and, in her own childlike way, tried to comfort him. She reached out and took his hand, giving it a small squeeze. It was such a simple gesture, but it nearly brought tears to Henry's eyes. As the weeks passed, Emily and Sophie settled into a new rhythm within Henry's home. The garage had become their temporary haven, and though it wasn't luxurious by any means, it was far better than the cold streets they had endured for months. Emily was deeply grateful for Henry's kindness, but there was always a lingering sense of guilt. She was determined to find a job and repay him in some way. Every morning, while Sophie played in the garden or read from one of Henry's old books, Emily would search for work. She had experience in clerical jobs, but the last few years had been tough. The economy hadn't been kind, and employers didn't exactly line up to hire a woman who had been out of work for an extended period. Still, she persisted, holding on to hope that something would come along. Henry, on the other hand, began to feel a growing attachment to Emily and Sophie. He wasn't used to sharing his space, but their presence no longer felt like an intrusion. In fact, it had become a comfort. The house, once filled only with the echo of his own footsteps, now had the warmth of life again. Sophie's laughter rang through the halls, and Emily's gentle hums as she helped Mrs. Jenkins in the kitchen or garden seemed to bring a kind of peace he hadn't known he needed. Yet amidst this growing connection, something gnawed at Henry. He couldn't shake the feeling that Emily's face was familiar. There were moments, small, fleeting moments, when he would catch a glimpse of her, and a memory would stir in the back of his mind, a memory he couldn't quite grasp. It was a strange sensation, as if there was something about her he should recognize but couldn't quite place. It wasn't until one rainy afternoon while he was sorting through old papers in his study that the pieces began to fall into place. The rain pattered against the large windows as Henry sifted through the stacks of letters and documents he had accumulated over the years. He hadn't looked through most of these things in ages, and many of them brought back memories from a time when his life had been filled with purpose and energy. He came across letters from old friends, business partners, and even correspondence from his late wife, Margaret. Each letter was a small reminder of a different chapter in his life. Then, at the bottom of the pile, he found something that made him pause. It was an old letter, yellowed with age, written in a familiar hand. The return address was one he hadn't seen in years, his brother's. Henry's brother, Richard, had been a sore subject for him for a long time. They had been close growing up, but life had pulled them in different directions. Richard had always been the more adventurous of the two, constantly chasing opportunities and dreams that took him far from home. Over the years, they had drifted apart, and eventually, the letters stopped coming. The letter in Henry's hands had been one of the last Richard had sent. He hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now, as he unfolded the brittle paper, he felt a strange sense of anticipation. His eyes scanned the familiar handwriting, and then he froze. There, nestled among the usual updates and pleasantries, was a line that struck him like a bolt of lightning. "And I wanted to let you know that I've recently had a daughter. Her name is Emily. I know things haven't always been easy between us, Henry, but I hope one day we can mend the rift and you can meet your niece. She's a special little girl, and I think you'd like her." Henry's breath caught in his throat as the pieces of the puzzle began to snap into place. Emily. Could it be? His mind raced as he tried to reconcile the woman living in his garage with the baby his brother had written about so many years ago. Could she be his niece? Could this woman, who had come into his life so unexpectedly, be part of the family he had lost? He sat back in his chair, stunned as memories of his estranged brother flooded his mind. He had never met Richard's daughter. Their relationship had deteriorated so much by the time Emily was born that they had stopped communicating altogether. But now, all these years later, it seemed fate had brought her into his life. Henry didn't know what to do with this revelation. Should he tell her? Would she even believe him? After all, Emily had never mentioned having any family, let alone a long-lost uncle. And what would she think of him, knowing that he had abandoned his relationship with her father long before she was born? As Henry wrestled with these thoughts, he decided to take things slowly. He wasn't ready to confront Emily just yet. Not until he was certain. But the more he observed her, the more convinced he became. There were small resemblances, the shape of her eyes, the way she smiled when she thought no one was looking. She reminded him of Richard, of the brother he had lost so long ago. While Henry was grappling with the discovery of Emily's true identity, something even more unexpected was about to unfold. It started with a knock on the door. It was a chilly evening, the sky darkening early as the seasons shifted toward winter. Mrs. Jenkins was the one who answered the door first, her usual no-nonsense demeanor shifting to one of concern as she saw the man standing on the doorstep. He was tall and rough-looking, with unkempt hair and a face that looked like it had seen more hard times than good. His clothes were shabby, and he carried an air of desperation that immediately set Mrs. Jenkins on edge. "Can I help you?" she asked cautiously, keeping the door only partially open. "I'm here to see Emily," the man said, his voice gruff and impatient. "She's staying here, isn't she?" Mrs. Jenkins hesitated. She didn't like the look of this man, and the way he spoke made her uneasy. "Who are you?" she asked, narrowing her eyes. The man shifted, glancing past her into the house. "I'm Michael. I've been looking for her. She owes me money." Mrs. Jenkins's unease deepened. Debt collectors showing up at the door of Henry Caldwell's mansion was not something that happened often, or ever. She quickly excused herself and went to fetch Henry, who had been reading in his study. Henry's face darkened when Mrs. Jenkins explained the situation. He didn't like the sound of this man, and the mention of Emily owing money sent a wave of protective anger through him. Emily hadn't mentioned anything about being in debt, but the fact that someone had tracked her down to his home filled him with a sense of urgency. When Henry approached the door, he found Michael still standing there, his eyes darting nervously around the grand entrance. There was something menacing about him, a kind of aggression simmering just below the surface. "I'm Henry Caldwell," he said, his voice steady but firm. "What is it you want with Emily?" Michael's eyes flickered with recognition. The name Caldwell carried weight in the city, and Michael knew he was dealing with someone powerful. Still, he didn't back down. "She owes me money," he repeated. "A lot of it. I lent her some cash when she was in a bad spot, and now I've come to collect." Henry's jaw tightened. "Emily is under my protection now," he said coldly. "Whatever business you had with her, it's over. You'll get no money from her here." Michael sneered, his confidence returning despite the imposing figure before him. "Is that right? Well, you should know that she didn't just borrow a few bucks. We're talking thousands. And if she doesn't pay up, I'll take something else, maybe her kid." That was the moment Henry's patience snapped. He took a step forward, his face inches from Michael's, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "If you ever so much as look in Sophie's direction, you'll regret it for the rest of your miserable life. Do you understand me?" Michael, clearly shaken by the intensity of Henry's threat, took a step back. He muttered something under his breath and turned to leave, but not before casting one last look at the house, his eyes narrowing. "This isn't over," he said darkly before disappearing into the night. Henry stood at the door for a long moment, his heart pounding with anger and fear. He knew that Michael wasn't going to give up so easily. The man had the look of someone desperate and dangerous, someone who would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. And now, Henry realized, Emily and Sophie were in far more danger than he had ever imagined. The moment he closed the door, Henry made a vow to himself. He would do whatever it took to keep them safe. The tension in the house was palpable after Michael's visit. Henry had hoped that his stern warning would be enough to send the man away for good, but something in Michael's parting words haunted him. There was a desperation in his eyes, the kind of look that could drive a man to do anything, no matter how reckless or dangerous. Henry knew that if he didn't act soon, the situation could escalate in ways that would put Emily and Sophie at even greater risk. That evening, Henry sat in his study, the flickering light from the fireplace casting long shadows across the room. He stared into the flames, his mind racing with possibilities. He couldn't confront this situation like a younger man might have. In his prime, he would have taken matters into his own hands. But now he had to rely on a more measured approach. His wealth and influence were still powerful tools, but he needed to be smart about how he used them. The first thing Henry did was contact his lawyer, a sharp and resourceful man named George Whitmore. George had handled Henry's legal affairs for decades, and Henry trusted him implicitly. He explained the situation to George, outlining everything from Emily's arrival to the appearance of Michael on his doorstep. George listened carefully, his tone calm but concerned. "Henry, you did the right thing by contacting me," George said after hearing the full story. "This Michael character sounds like trouble. If he's extorting Emily for money she doesn't have, we can get the authorities involved. But first, we need to make sure she's protected." Henry nodded, even though George couldn't see him over the phone. "That's my priority," he said, his voice firm. "Emily and Sophie can't live in fear. I won't allow it." George paused, considering the options. "We can file a restraining order, which will keep him legally barred from coming near them. But you know as well as I do that paper isn't always enough to stop someone who's desperate. We'll need something more." Henry's grip on the phone tightened. "What do you suggest?" "I suggest we take this to the police. If Michael has a history of exploiting vulnerable people, they might already be familiar with him. We can build a case, but we'll need Emily's cooperation. She'll have to tell us everything she knows about him." Henry had anticipated this. He knew that Emily had been reluctant to talk about her past, especially about the debts she owed. But this situation had reached a point where silence was no longer an option. She needed to open up if they were going to protect her and Sophie from Michael's threats. Later that night, Henry found Emily sitting in the small living room area near the garage. Sophie was asleep upstairs, and the house was quiet except for the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Emily looked up when Henry entered, her face pale and strained from the stress of the last few days. "We need to talk," Henry said gently, taking a seat across from her. Emily nodded, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and resignation. She had been expecting this conversation. "I'm sorry," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I never wanted to bring this kind of trouble into your life, Henry. You've already done so much for us." Henry held up a hand to stop her. "You don't have to apologize. This isn't your fault, Emily. But we need to address it head on if we're going to keep you and Sophie safe." Emily swallowed hard and looked down at her hands, which were clasped tightly in her lap. For a long moment she said nothing, and Henry waited patiently, knowing this wasn't easy for her. Finally she began to speak. "I met Michael about a year ago," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was right after Sophie got sick. She had a severe case of pneumonia, and I didn't have insurance. The hospital bills were piling up, and I didn't know what to do. I was desperate." Henry listened carefully, his heart heavy with empathy for what she had gone through. "Michael seemed kind at first," Emily continued, her eyes distant as she recalled the past. "He offered me money, just enough to get by, he said. I thought it was a loan, something I could repay once I got back on my feet. But I was naive. The interest he charged was outrageous, and every time I made a payment, the amount I owed only seemed to grow." She paused, her voice cracking with emotion. "Eventually I couldn't keep up. I lost my job, we were evicted from our apartment, and Michael started threatening me. He said if I didn't pay him back, he would take Sophie away. I didn't know where else to turn." Henry's heart ached for her. He could see how deeply she had suffered, trying to protect her daughter from a world that seemed determined to crush them both. "Emily," he said softly, leaning forward, "Michael is dangerous, and I've already spoken to my lawyer. We're going to take this to the police, but we need your help. You'll have to tell them everything, just like you've told me." Emily looked up, her eyes wide with fear. "The police? Henry, I'm scared. What if they can't stop him? What if he comes after us?" Henry reached out and gently took her hand. "We won't let that happen. I won't let that happen. You're not alone in this anymore." Emily's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. She had no other choice. If she didn't face Michael now, she would be living in fear for the rest of her life, and Sophie deserved better than that. The next morning, Henry, Emily, and George met with the local authorities. They filed a report detailing Michael's extortion and threats. The police, who were familiar with men like Michael, took the case seriously and assured them that they would investigate. They also advised Emily to obtain a restraining order, which George helped her file immediately. For the next several days, the household was tense, waiting for news from the police. Henry took extra precautions, hiring security to patrol the property and ensuring that Emily and Sophie were never alone. He felt a deep responsibility for their safety, a responsibility that had only grown stronger since discovering that Emily might be his niece. 1 week after filing the report, Henry received a call from the police. They had tracked down Michael, and it turned out that he was involved in a much larger criminal operation than anyone had realized. He had been extorting money from numerous vulnerable people in the area, using threats and intimidation to keep them in line. With the evidence provided by Emily and others, the police were able to arrest him and shut down his operation. When Henry delivered the news to Emily, she broke down in tears, this time tears of relief. For the first time in over a year, she felt like she could breathe again. The weight of fear and anxiety that had been crushing her for so long was finally beginning to lift. But there was still one more thing that Henry needed to address. That evening, after Sophie had gone to bed and the house had fallen into its usual quiet, Henry asked Emily to join him in the study. He had been waiting for the right moment to tell her what he had discovered, and now that the immediate danger had passed, he knew it was time. Emily entered the study, her expression calm but curious. She had noticed a change in Henry over the last few days, something more than just concern for her safety. There was a tension in his demeanor, as if he were holding back something important. "Henry, is everything all right?" she asked, taking a seat across from him. Henry sat behind his desk, his hands folded in front of him. He took a deep breath, unsure of how to begin. "Emily, there's something I need to tell you," he said slowly, his voice steady but serious. "Something that I only recently discovered." Emily frowned, confused by the tone of his voice. "What is it?" Henry reached for a small yellowed letter that lay on the desk in front of him. He had read it dozens of times over the past few days, memorizing every word. Now, he slid it across the desk toward her. "This is a letter from my brother, Richard," Henry said quietly. "It's from many years ago, long before we lost touch. In it, he mentions that he had a daughter. Your name is in that letter, Emily." Emily's eyes widened in shock. She looked down at the letter, her hands trembling slightly as she unfolded it. Her gaze scanned the page, her breath catching as she read the words that confirmed what Henry had just told her. I don't understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "My father, I never knew him. My mother always told me he left before I was born." Henry's heart ached as he saw the confusion and pain on her face. "Your father was my brother," he said gently. "I didn't know until recently, but now that I do, I can't ignore it. You're my niece, Emily." Emily looked up, tears welling in her eyes. "I spent my whole life believing I had no family," she whispered. "And now, after all this time—" Henry rose from his chair and walked around the desk, kneeling in front of her. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his own eyes misting with emotion. "You're not alone anymore," he said softly. "You have family now. You have me." For a long moment they sat there in silence, the weight of the revelation settling between them. Emily, who had spent so many years struggling on her own, suddenly realized that she had a place where she belonged. And Henry, who had spent so many years in isolation, finally understood that family wasn't just something he had lost. It was something he had found again. From that moment on, their bond only deepened. Emily and Sophie moved into the main house, and Henry's home was no longer the empty, echoing mansion it had once been. It was filled with laughter, with warmth, and with love. Sophie, who had been so quiet and reserved when they first arrived, blossomed under Henry's care. She adored him, and in turn, he became the grandfather she had never known. As the months passed, the pain of the past began to fade, replaced by the joy of the present and the hope for the future. Henry, Emily, and Sophie were no longer strangers brought together by chance. They were family, bound by love, loyalty, and the promise of new beginnings. In the months that followed, the mansion that had once echoed with emptiness and silence transformed into something Henry never thought possible, a home filled with life, laughter, and the kind of warmth he hadn't felt in decades. Emily and Sophie had settled into the main house, and Henry had insisted that they make themselves as comfortable as possible, treating every part of the mansion as their own. Gone were the days when Henry would wander the vast halls alone, listening to the lonely click of his shoes against the marble floors. Now, the house felt alive. Sophie's light footsteps often skipped through the corridors, and her laughter rang out as she played in the gardens or darted through the rooms, her energy infectious. Henry found himself looking forward to the simple routines they had established. The shared meals in the dining room, the evenings spent by the fireplace, and the moments where Sophie would climb onto his lap, eagerly asking him to read her a story. It wasn't just Sophie who had changed his world. Emily had also flourished since Michael's arrest. With the weight of fear lifted from her shoulders, she began to rebuild her life in ways she hadn't thought possible. Henry had offered to help her find work, but instead she decided to pursue something she had always dreamed of, but never had the opportunity to explore: starting her own business. She had a natural talent for baking, a skill she had honed during the hard times when money was tight, and she had learned to make do with whatever ingredients were available. Henry, seeing her passion, encouraged her to follow this dream. He helped her rent a small shop in the town center and connected her with people who could assist in setting up her business. With his support, Emily opened a cozy bakery specializing in homemade bread, pastries, and desserts that quickly became the talk of the town. Customers flocked to her shop, drawn not only by the delicious food but also by Emily's warm personality. She had a way of making everyone feel welcome, and the bakery became more than just a place to buy sweets. It became a community hub, a place where people gathered to chat, laugh, and share stories. Emily's success in the bakery filled Henry with pride. He watched her grow into her new role with confidence, marveling at her resilience. She had come from such difficult circumstances, yet she had not only survived but thrived, and in a way her growth mirrored his own. For the first time in years, Henry felt as though he had a purpose again. He had spent so long locked away in his grief, thinking his life's best moments were behind him. But Emily and Sophie had brought light back into his world. He had become a father figure to Emily, offering her advice and guidance, and with Sophie he had found the role of a grandfather that he had never thought he would get to experience. One evening, as the three of them sat together by the fireplace, the glow of the flames casting a soft light over the room, Henry realized how much his life had changed. Sophie was curled up next to him, her head resting on his arm, her eyes beginning to droop as she fought against sleep. Emily sat in the armchair across from them, a contented smile on her face as she sipped a cup of tea. "This house feels different now," Emily said softly, glancing around the room. "It's hard to believe it's the same place I first came to all those months ago." Henry nodded, his heart swelling with emotion. "It is different," he replied. "You and Sophie have made it feel like a home again." Emily's smile widened and she looked down at her teacup for a moment before speaking again. "I never thought we'd have this, a real home, I mean. After everything we've been through, I wasn't sure it was possible." "You deserve it," Henry said, his voice filled with sincerity. "You've been through more than anyone should have to, and you came out stronger because of it." Emily's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I couldn't have done it without you," she whispered. "You saved us, Henry. You gave us a chance when no one else would." Henry shook his head, his voice soft but firm. "No, Emily, you saved yourselves. I only gave you the opportunity. You did the rest." There was a long, comfortable silence as they sat together, the only sound the crackling of the fire and Sophie's soft breathing as she drifted off to sleep. Henry looked down at the little girl, his heart swelling with a kind of love he hadn't known he was capable of feeling. In Sophie he had found a second chance, not just at being a guardian, but at being a part of something bigger than himself. She had brought joy and wonder back into his life, and he was eternally grateful for it. In the weeks that followed, Henry became an integral part of Emily's business. Though he had no experience in baking, he enjoyed spending time at the shop, helping where he could and greeting customers. The townspeople had always known him as the reclusive millionaire, a man who lived in the grand house on the hill but rarely ventured out. Now, they saw him in a new light. He was approachable, warm, and most of all, happy. Word about Emily's bakery spread beyond the town's borders, and soon people from neighboring areas began visiting. The business grew, and with Henry's help, Emily expanded her operations, hiring staff, and even opening a second location. But despite the success, Emily never lost sight of what truly mattered: her family. Henry watched in awe as Emily juggled her growing business with her responsibilities as a mother. She always made time for Sophie, ensuring that no matter how busy things got, her daughter knew she was loved and cared for, and Henry was there every step of the way, offering his support in whatever way he could. The bond between the three of them grew stronger with each passing day, and the mansion that had once been a symbol of loneliness was now a place of love and connection. Sophie, too, blossomed in the newfound stability of her life. She was no longer the quiet, reserved child Henry had first met. She was full of life, her laughter bright and infectious. She adored Henry, often referring to him as Grandpa Henry, a title that filled his heart with pride every time he heard it. He took her on adventures around the estate, teaching her about the flowers in the garden, showing her the secret nooks and crannies of the house, and telling her stories about his life with Margaret. Sophie loved hearing about the woman who had once filled Henry's heart, and she often asked to visit the small memorial garden Henry had built for her. It was during one such visit that Henry realized just how much Sophie had changed his life. They were sitting on a stone bench in the garden surrounded by blooming roses, the same kind Margaret had once loved so much. Sophie, her small hands clasped in her lap, looked up at Henry with wide, thoughtful eyes. "Do you miss her, Grandpa Henry?" she asked quietly. Henry nodded, his gaze drifting to the roses. "I do. Every day." Sophie was silent for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think she knows we're happy?" Henry's breath caught in his throat at the innocence and wisdom in her question. He had never thought of it that way, but as he sat there, looking at the roses and feeling the warmth of Sophie's presence beside him, he realized that in a way, Margaret's memory had shaped this new chapter of his life. She had always been the one to encourage kindness, to help those in need. It was because of her that he had stopped that day, that he had opened his heart to Emily and Sophie. In a way, Margaret had been with him all along, guiding him toward this new beginning. "I think she does," Henry said softly, his voice filled with emotion, "and I think she's happy that we're happy." Sophie smiled, a bright, beautiful smile that lit up her face. "I think so too." As they sat together in the garden, Henry felt a deep sense of peace wash over him. His life, once filled with loneliness and sorrow, had been transformed in ways he could never have imagined. He had found a family, not through blood but through love, and in doing so he had found a new purpose, a reason to wake up each day with joy in his heart and hope for the future. Years passed and Henry grew older, but he never felt alone. Emily's bakery continued to thrive, and Sophie grew into a bright, compassionate young woman, her love for Henry unwavering. The mansion, which had once been a symbol of isolation, became a place where people gathered, friends, family, and neighbors all drawn to the warmth and love that radiated from within its walls. And when Henry's time eventually came, he passed away peacefully, surrounded by the people he loved. His legacy wasn't the wealth he left behind or the grand estate that bore his name. It was the love he had given to Emily and Sophie, the family he had created out of an act of kindness. His memory lived on in the hearts of those who knew him, and the story of the elderly millionaire who had taken in a homeless woman and her daughter became a cherished tale passed down through generations. In the end, Henry Caldwell had found something far more valuable than the riches he had accumulated over his lifetime. He had found a family, and in doing so he had discovered that true wealth was not measured in money but in the love, connection, and joy that filled his final years.